A flight attendant slapped a black teen for simply asking for water, but his father stood up from seat 1A, and the entire cabin went silent. He slapped the black teen for asking water, thinking no one would challenge him mid-flight. He didn't realize the father in seat 1A had already decided this act wouldn't go unanswered. Subscribe if you believe disrespect always meets instant accountability. The slap came first, a sharp, sudden crack that cut through the soft hum of Aerolith Flight 417 like a blade. Passengers in the nearby rows jolted in their seats as 14-year-old Jalen Rurick's head snapped to the side, his cheeks stinging with a blooming heat he hadn't expected, couldn't understand, and had no time to prepare for. For a moment, the entire cabin froze, steward meal trays suspended mid-air, conversations halted, breaths caught halfway between inhale and exhale. Corvin Morell, the stern flight attendant standing over him, didn't move at all. His hand hovered where the strike had ended, fingers stiff, palm trembling just enough to reveal the flash of anger that had pushed him to hit a boy, an unarmed, soft-spoken boy who had only asked for water. Jalen stared at him through wide, watering eyes, tried to make sense of what had just happened. His thoughts raced, stumbling over themselves like frightened footsteps in a narrow hallway. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't argued. He had only asked twice. A faint ringing filled his ears as Corvin drew in a breath, chest rising sharply beneath his uniform. The man's expression twisted with a mix of irritation and something darker, something that didn't belong on the face of anyone tasked with caring for passengers. Rows around Jalen shifted uneasily. A man in seat 8B leaned forward, his brows furrowed, as if debating whether to intervene. Another man farther up the aisle turned his head slightly, his jaw tight with concern. Yet no one spoke. No one moved. The shock trapped them all in silence. Jalen lifted a hand to his cheek, his fingers trembling as they met the warmth spreading beneath the skin. His heart pounded, a heavy thumping that filled his throat. He tried to steady his breathing, but each inhale felt sharp, almost painful. He didn't understand why this had happened. He only knew it wasn't supposed to. Sit back, Corvin snapped, though his voice lowered once he realized the attention he had drawn. His words came through clenched teeth, his posture rigid, as if preparing to defend himself from questions he hoped no one would ask. Service hasn't started. You wait when you're told to wait. Jalen didn't answer. He couldn't. His thoughts tangled, colliding in confusion and shame. He had only wanted water. He had raised his hand politely like he always did. He had spoken softly, carefully, the way his father taught him when dealing with adults in tense environments. But none of it mattered. Not to Corvin. The warm cabin lights seemed to dim around him as his chest tightened. He swallowed hard, tried to push down the rising fear. The slap had been quick, so quick he wasn't sure if anyone would believe him if not for the ringing sound still echoing across the rows. Then came a shift. At the front of the plane, in seat 1A, a man lifted his head. Dr. Arden Rurik had been sitting with quiet posture, reviewing a document on the small screen folded out before him. But the slap's echo had carried farther than Corvin realized. Arden's eyes lifted slowly, his expression unchanged but sharpened with a subtle alertness that only those who knew him well would recognize. Jalen didn't see him yet. He sat frozen, his fingers still touching the burning cheek, his eyes locked on Corvin, who now seemed more anxious than angry. Corvin's breath grew uneven as he noticed a few passengers whispering. One man muttered, "That boy didn't do anything." Another whispered, "He barely spoke." Corvin's jaw twitched. His eyes darted left, right, searching for an escape from the sudden attention. His earlier confidence cracked, replaced by a thin, nervous tension that settled into the lines of his face. He adjusted his tie, swallowed, and stepped back half a pace, though he tried to mask the movement as a routine shift in position. Jalen exhaled shakily, his voice trapped somewhere behind the fear pressing against his throat. He wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words refused to come. He didn't want trouble. He didn't want conflict. He didn't want to disappoint his father. Yet here he was, with a stinging cheek, a dry throat, and a cabin full of strangers watching him in stunned silence. He lowered his gaze, thinking maybe if he stayed still, the moment would fade. But this moment wasn't fading. Not for him. Not for the passengers. And definitely not for the man, now, standing quietly from seat 1A. Arden's slow rise wasn't dramatic or loud. It was silent, measured, deliberate, and far more unsettling to those who noticed than any outburst could have been. The subtle motion carried a kind of controlled intensity that made even the air feel heavier. Jalen still didn't see him, but the passengers did. Their eyes widened just slightly, sensing that something powerful, something decisive, was moving toward them. Corbin noticed too. His spine straightened, his breathing hitched, and for the briefest second, fear flickered behind his eyes. Jalen wiped his cheek gently, trying not to wince, unaware that someone who cared for him more than anyone else on the plane had already sensed the truth of what happened. He didn't know yet that everything was about to change the moment those steady footsteps began moving down the aisle. He didn't know yet that someone was coming for him. But Arden knew. He always knew. And as the cabin continued to hang in stunned silence, Jalen felt the weight of unseen eyes finally shift toward him, signaling the start of something far larger than a single slap. At the front of the plane, Arden's head lifted slowly, sensing something was wrong long before anyone dared speak. Corbin's hand was still hovering in the air when Dr. Arden Rurik rose from seat 1A. The sharp echo of the slap had barely faded, yet the entire cabin seemed to shrink as Arden's presence shifted. He did not burst forward or shout. Instead, he stood with a measured stillness, the kind that made strangers instinctively lean away. His gaze locked on Jalen's reddened cheek, and a quiet storm formed behind his eyes. Without a word, he began walking down the aisle, each step firm and precise, his shoes tapping lightly against the floor as though marking time before judgment. Passengers parted instinctively, sensing the weight of his focus. Corbin's confident posture faltered the closer Arden came. The attendant tried to compose himself, straightening his vest, but his fingers twitched at the seams. Jalen sat frozen, his breath shallow, his eyes wide with shock. When Arden reached him, he lowered himself to one knee, his movements controlled, as if afraid any sudden gesture would make his son flinch harder. "Jalen," he said softly, his voice steady despite the tension tightening his neck. "Look at me." He examined the cheek with gentle fingers, the faint swelling already visible. Jalen tried to speak, but Arden shook his head lightly. "You're all right. I'm here." Behind them, Corbin forced out a shaky explanation. He raised his voice at me. I simply... Arden's head turned, slow and deliberate. His expression did not show anger. It showed precision, like a man who categorized every detail before acting. He raised his voice. Arden repeated, his tone flat, almost clinical. Passengers exchanged glances. A man from row 8 whispered. The boy barely spoke. Corbin stiffened. He was being difficult. Jalen shook his head weakly. A few passengers murmured agreement. The truth spread through the cabin like a quiet wind. Arden rose slowly, positioning himself between Jalen and the attendant. His posture was calm, but carried the unmistakable gravity of someone accustomed to handling situations far larger than this. He spoke evenly, without emotion. "Bring the water now." Corbin faltered. "The service hasn't started yet." "This is not about service," Arden replied. "This is about compliance." His voice did not rise, but its firmness carried a weight that made Corbin shift his footing. As Corbin hesitated, Arden's fingers brushed the edge of his wristwatch. A nearly invisible gesture, but intentional. The device responded with a faint pulse beneath his skin. A recording began silently, capturing everything. His training resurfaced flawlessly. Stay composed, gather evidence, protect the victim before anything else. Dramatic irony thickened in the air. Corbin had no idea who he was dealing with. To him, Arden was just another passenger. But Arden's calm was not ordinary calm. It was the discipline of a senior investigator who spent years evaluating truth under pressure, years practicing how to remain unshaken even when the world tilted. Corbin tried again, voice tight. Sir, I'll need you to return to your seat. You're causing. Arden stepped forward, only an inch, but it was enough to make Corvin retreat. I will not step anywhere until you answer for what you just did. A ripple passed through the passengers. Someone exhaled sharply. Corvin opened his mouth, closed it, then forced a shrug. Fine, I'll get the water. He took a step back, but Arden's voice, low and unwavering, stopped him mid-turn. You will bring it now. The attendant swallowed hard and moved toward the galley. But even as he walked, his posture betrayed confusion, fear that the situation had slipped far beyond his control. Arden returned his attention to Jalen, brushing a strand of hair from the boy's forehead. Jalen leaned into the touch, still trembling. From the cockpit, the pilot's voice came over the intercom, calm but distracted. Cabin crew, prepare for routine check. But the routine was gone. Arden straightened, his shoulders squared, his composure colder than steel. Corvin returned with the cup, hand unsteady. Arden took it without breaking eye contact, handing it gently to Jalen before stepping forward again. Step back from my son. The line cut through the aisle like a blade of silence. Corvin finally realized he had crossed a line he could never hide again. Varek Dunn moved into the aisle like a barrier thrown into place, his expression sharp and voice firmer than necessary. Sir, I need you to return to your seat now, he commanded, stepping directly between Arden and Corvin. The movement was sudden enough to make nearby passengers flinch. His eyes darted toward the captain's light, as if hoping authority from above would settle what he clearly couldn't. Arden didn't move. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying Varek with the same stillness he had used in foreign interrogations, a quiet measure of intent wrapped in poise. You've just entered an active misconduct investigation, Arden said, his tone so level it chilled the space around them. I suggest you consider your next action very carefully. Varek doubled down. The passenger, your son, raised his voice and created tension. That's a violation of FAA behavior codes. Please return to your seat. But the lie didn't have the room to breathe. No, sir. A deep voice interrupted from row 9. A middle-aged man in a beige vest leaned forward. That boy never raised his voice. He asked for water politely. Another joined in. He even said, "Thank you," murmured an older man near the emergency exit, still clutching his crossword. Arden didn't need to look around. He already knew the tide had turned. Varek hesitated, his hand now unconsciously resting near Arden's wrist where the sleek, black watch hummed silently against his skin. That device needs to be turned off, Varek said abruptly, his tone sharper now. No unauthorized recording. You'd better let go of that hand, said the man in row 9 again, firmer this time. But Varek made the move. He reached. It was a mistake. In one smooth shift, Arden drew his arms slightly back and pivoted his shoulder, slipping from the reach like water around stone. That watch, he said calmly, has already transmitted a full copy of this cabin's audio to an encrypted channel in the communication bay. I advise you to stop touching things you don't understand. Jalen stirred beside his father, his voice soft. Dad. Arden turned gently, pressing a hand to Jalen's shoulder. You did everything right. You stay calm now. Corvin, who had hung back slightly, sensing the structure around him collapsing, suddenly leaned forward with feigned indignation. This is ridiculous. That boy reached for me first. Grabbed my uniform. No, he didn't, someone whispered. A different voice added, didn't even move. Do you still want to make that your official account? Arden asked, turning back to Corvin. Is that your final statement before I open a formal case? The line hung in the air like frost. Corvin's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He swallowed instead, realizing too late the significance of what had just been said and recorded. The cabin's atmosphere shifted. The whispers that had once belonged to passengers now had the clarity of testimony. The man in 11A leaned forward and murmured something to the person next to him. A young adult in the exit row slowly tilted his phone to capture the standoff. Varek stepped back half an inch, just enough to show nerves, his gaze flickering toward Corvin as if silently demanding backup. But the damage was done. At that moment, from the last row, a slender man with shaky hands and sweat on his brow, stood up awkwardly. He stammered, voice trembling. I recorded it. He raised a small tablet. The screen paused mid-frame, Jalen flinching, Corvin's hand mid-swing. But Arden didn't even glance at the screen yet. He focused on something else, movement, timing, patterns. He was calculating. Passengers leaned into the moment, some instinctively straightening in their seats, others gripping armrests like the plane had hit turbulence. The moment had become more than confrontation. It was turning into revelation. And that's when the whisper came. From the front of the galley, just behind Varek's half-turned body, Corvin leaned close and hissed under his breath, "The program's going to burn if this gets out." Arden's head turned, fractional precise. He had heard it, and now everything changed. The slap had been the surface, the lie, the spark. But this whisper? This was gasoline on fire. Without blinking, Arden adjusted his posture slightly, shifting to stand directly between Jalen and the two attendants. His arm hung relaxed at his side, but passengers who had been in law enforcement or military recognized the subtle stance. It was defensive readiness, quiet, balanced, and waiting. From above, the captain's voice echoed through the intercom. "This is your captain. We ask all passengers to remain seated as we assess a cabin matter. Please do not interfere with crew operations." Arden's eyes narrowed. The captain didn't know. Not yet. A man in Tindy leaned toward his neighbor. "What program?" he whispered. "What are they talking about?" No one had an answer, but the entire cabin knew now. This wasn't just about a slap. Jalen, his voice almost lost in the air, whispered, "Dad, what does he mean?" Arden's expression didn't change, but his voice, though quiet, carried far enough for Corvin and Varek to hear. "Something bigger than a slap," he said, "is about to unravel." "Wait." The voice cracked through the silence like a dropped glass. Heads turned. In the center of the cabin, a thin, pale teenage boy slowly stood up, clutching a trembling tablet in both hands. His knuckles were white, his voice shaking. I have it. I recorded everything." The entire plane froze. Corvin Morell's face turned bone white, his eyes darting toward the source of the voice like a man watching his verdict walk into the courtroom. Varek's jaw slackened. Arden Rurik didn't move, not yet. His gaze locked onto the boy with quiet calculation. The passenger stepped forward into the aisle, hands raised slightly like he needed the cabin's permission to speak. "My name's Rendell. I was recording the clouds out the window," he explained, motioning to the still-playing video. But the moment Corvin slapped the boy, "It's right here," he turned the screen outward. A sharp intake of breath swept across the aisle like wind through dry grass. The unmistakable sound of the slap played out again on the tablet. Loud, echoing, irrefutable. Jalen's small flinch. The collective gasp. And Corvin's face, frozen in fury. Arden exhaled once, quiet and purposeful. His objective sharpened in an instant. This was no longer about confrontation. It was about containment and precision. He took 2 steps forward toward Rendell, extended his hand slowly, and said, "May I see it?" Rendell nodded and passed it forward, still shaking. Arden held the device gently, as if it were a living witness. He watched the clip in full silence. Once, twice. Then he looked up. "Thank you, Rendell," he said. "You've just ensured the truth cannot be altered." From behind, Corvin hissed under his breath, turning toward Varek in a barely audible snarl. "The program's going to burn if this gets out." That was all it took. Arden didn't react outwardly, but inside, a bolt of ice settled behind his ribs. The phrase hung in the air like a misplaced confession. Program? His mind narrowed instantly. This wasn't just about a hot-headed attendant losing control. This was structured, hidden, organized. He turned slowly. "Both of you," he said to Corvin and Varek, "return to your assigned seats." Now, Varek straightened. "You don't give orders here," he said, trying to sound firm, but the wobble in his voice betrayed him. "You're not. I said sit." Arden's tone didn't rise, but it held a weight that bent wills. When Varek took a hesitant step forward, Arden shifted, blocking him with one arm. A subtle twist of his wrist angled Varek's movement backward without force, just precision. Varek stumbled slightly and backed down. Passengers murmured. No one had ever seen a man handle two flight attendants with such calm control. It was at that moment the cockpit door opened with a quiet click. Captain Redden Vale stepped into the aisle, adjusting his collar and expecting to mediate a customer complaint. But what he saw rooted him in place. A young boy with a red cheek. Passengers tense and alert. Two attendants looking cornered. And a man in a black jacket holding a tablet, like it was evidence in a tribunal. "What is going on?" Redden asked, stepping forward. Arden didn't miss a beat. "Captain, we need to talk about what your crew has done and what they're hiding." The captain's expression shifted from confusion to alarm as he realized the situation was far more serious than he imagined. "Let's not escalate this further," Captain Redden Vale said as he stepped into the aisle, his voice strained beneath a practiced calm. But his authority buckled almost immediately when Arden Rurik, still standing protectively beside his son, spoke without even turning his head. "Captain," he said quietly, "I'm requesting the full crew log for this flight and the disciplinary records of both attendants, Mr. Morrell and Mr. Dunn." The words landed like stone on glass. A hush fell over the cabin as passengers shifted in their seats, watching how the balance of power had subtly shifted. Jalen, sitting stiffly in 7C with a makeshift ice pack held gently to his cheek, glanced toward his father. Though his face ached and his pulse still pounded in his ears, he sensed that something deeper was unraveling, something that reached far beyond a slap. Captain Redden hesitated. "I'm not authorized to share those documents mid-flight," he began, tone tightening. "This can all be handled after landing." Arden turned then, slowly, with a measured step toward the captain. His eyes were unreadable, calm but razor-focused. "Mr. Vale," he said, voice even and clipped, "I have reason to believe the integrity of this aircraft's internal conduct is compromised. If we wait, you risk losing evidence. Mr. Morrell has already altered his initial account. I suggest immediate procedural isolation of all crew statements, and that you seal the logs until investigators can retrieve them." A murmur rustled through the cabin. The passengers were no longer just observers. They were witnesses locked inside a pressure-sealed chamber with a truth trying to claw its way out. Across the aisle, Varric Dunn leaned toward Corvin Morrell and whispered something sharp and rapid. Arden didn't react, but his ears caught the phrase like a hunter snaring the rustle of brush. "Signal the program coordinator." The phrase froze him, not just because of the words, but because of what they implied. "Program?" Arden's expression didn't change, but his fingers subtly moved across the face of his watch. With a practiced rhythm, he triggered a coded alert, an encrypted pulse that would transmit to Aerocline Integrity Bureau headquarters and flag flight 417 for immediate federal intercept upon landing. It was a measure used only in the gravest of cases, one designed to protect evidence before anyone had a chance to bury it. Across the cabin, Corvin suddenly rose with a jolt, turning toward the rear galley. I need to check on—" "No, you don't," a tall passenger in a flannel shirt said, standing halfway into the aisle and blocking his path. Another man stood beside him, arms crossed. "Sit down," he said. "We saw what you did." Corvin's mouth twitched, eyes darting from one face to another. He realized too late that the cabin had become a wall. He was sealed in with the very people he had dismissed as silent bystanders. But they weren't silent now. Arden took a slow step forward, placing a hand gently on Jalen's shoulder. The boy relaxed slightly beneath his father's palm. "I strongly suggest no one attempts to leave their designated area," Arden said, addressing the attendants, the captain, and every passenger within earshot. "This cabin is now under procedural observation. Any interference with evidence, verbal, physical, or digital, will be treated as obstruction." Captain Redden's jaw tightened. "You don't have the authority to make that kind of declaration on board my—" "Actually," Arden interrupted, voice still calm, "I do." His gaze didn't waver. His tone didn't rise. But something about the sheer steadiness of his presence made even the captain pause mid-sentence. Redden's voice faltered, then disappeared altogether. Jalen watched, wide-eyed but steady, taking in every second. He wasn't just watching his father protect him. He was watching a system of power reconfigure itself in real time. Something deeper than anger stirred inside him. It felt like truth was winning. In the aisle, Varric shifted uneasily. Corvin had slumped back into his seat, face pale and twitching with nervous energy. The whisper of program coordinator echoed unspoken through the silence, becoming the unseen thread that tied everything together. What had started as a slap had become something else, something carefully hidden, perhaps long-running. Arden's hand tightened once around his watch. "Captain," he said finally, the edge of steel now unmistakable in his voice. "We both know this aircraft can't land fast enough. But until it does, I'll be standing right here." And then, as the flight gently dipped into its descent arc and cabin lights flickered to a dimmer tone, the truth settled over the passengers like gravity. The flight was no longer about its destination. It had become a sealed chamber of truth where no lie could survive. Corvin lunged for the interphone with a burst of desperation, his hand slamming the receiver off its cradle as he barked. "We have a passenger threat in the main cabin. Repeat, passenger threat." His voice cut sharply through the tense air, but it was the wrong move, too late, too loud, and too clearly panicked. The passengers stiffened, some gasping in confusion, others bristling at the blatant attempt to twist the truth. The sound of Rendell's tablet, still playing the video of Corvin slapping Jalen, echoed behind his false report like a damning chorus of reality. Arden stepped forward immediately, eyes sharp, posture calm, but commanding. "That's enough," he said, his voice low but cutting through the noise with precision. "Terminate the call. Now." Corvin turned to face him, jaw twitching, but something in Arden's presence, steady, immovable, made him pause. "You're tampering with the chain of evidence and violating protocol," Arden continued. "This entire cabin is a witness, and you're about to add obstruction to your list of errors." The captain, watching from the forward aisle, seemed torn. His eyes flicked from Corvin to Arden, then to the passengers who now murmured openly, some even pointing to the screen where Jalen's face turned in stunned pain beneath Corvin's hand. Redden Vale, whose voice had once commanded the aircraft, now felt like a visitor in his own domain. "Sir, if I may," he began. "You may not," Arden interrupted evenly. "I need you to verify all passenger video recordings immediately and secure the interphone. It's no longer a neutral communication line. This is now a matter of integrity, not convenience." As if to punctuate Arden's statement, a teenage boy too rose back, leaned forward, and whispered, "He's hiding something behind the seat." His voice was quiet, almost hesitant, but clear enough. Arden turned his head slightly, following the boy's gaze to the narrow space between seats 10A and 10B. There, half concealed beneath a folded blanket, was a clipboard. He reached down and retrieved it slowly, making sure everyone could see he wasn't taking it for himself, but handling it as evidence. The clipboard felt heavier than expected, not in weight, but in implication. Its surface was filled with handwritten notes, irregular flight annotations, passenger initials matched against seat numbers, and cryptic comments that had nothing to do with beverage service or safety procedures. One note stood out in block letters. "Monitor flagged individuals. Report reactions." A murmur rippled across the cabin. Arden's fingers hovered above the text, his mind already fitting the pieces together. This wasn't just misconduct. It wasn't a rogue attendant losing control. This was coordinated, planned, and possibly institutional. He turned to the captain. "Are these standard crew logs?" he asked, though the tone of his voice already carried the answer. Captain Vale's face paled. I don't recognize those codes," he admitted. "They're not from the flight manual. Then they don't belong here." Arden's voice was harder now. "This," he held up the clipboard, "may be evidence of something much worse than assault." Dramatic irony tightened around the scene like a vice. Corvin sat slouched in seat 12C, the very image of a man watching his career bleed out of him. Varric pretended to be absorbed in his uniform sleeve, but his foot tapped rapidly beneath the fold-down jump seat. Passengers watched with bated breath, unsure if they were witnesses, victims, or just next in line. One man, middle-aged and sharp-eyed, leaned to his neighbor and whispered, This isn't the first time I've flown with that guy. He's always weirdly focused on certain people. Foreshadowing curled through the cabin like smoke. Arden placed the clipboard beside the still-playing tablet on a nearby tray table. His hands were steady, but inside his thoughts raced. Why the codes? Why the note? Who is authorizing this? The captain approached him again, quieter this time. Who exactly are you? Arden turned slowly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. The cabin seemed to pause, as if the plane itself was holding its breath. I'm the person who will make sure every truth on this plane reaches daylight. Turbulence jolted the cabin with a sudden shudder, forcing overhead compartments to rattle and seatbelts to tighten across laps. Jalen's hands clutched the armrests, his fingers turning pale as the aircraft dipped momentarily. He blinked through the flickering lights above, trying not to let the tension swallow him. Beside him, the folded blanket he'd barely touched now slid to the floor unnoticed. But then he felt it, his father's hand resting firmly on his shoulder. Dr. Arden Rurik leaned in from the aisle, his touch neither forceful nor soft, but steady, like an anchor thrown into choppy waters. Jalen glanced up. Arden nodded once, his expression unreadable but deeply reassuring. A calm within the storm. Seatbelts, everyone. We're beginning our descent. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom. Arden's gaze didn't leave Jalen as the announcement ended. But moments later, Captain Reddenvale himself appeared at the front of the cabin. He motioned subtly for Arden to follow. Without a word, Arden stood and followed the captain into the narrow galley corridor, where the stale scent of coffee mixed with metallic air and tension. The walls here were tight, insulated, the hum of the aircraft louder. Yet it felt like a whisper compared to the storm beneath Arden's voice. He didn't waste time. Captain Vale, Arden began, his tone measured. Explain this. He held up the clipboard labeled Observation Rotation A. His finger tapped once, precisely, on a handwritten line that read, Flagged Individuals 7C. The captain squinted, then looked at Arden, hesitant. I've seen notes like this before. Not this exact one, but similar symbols. I thought they were just internal codes. Did you ever ask? Arden's voice was firm, but not loud. The question hovered between them, heavier than the air. Captain Vale shifted uncomfortably. No, it wasn't my role to... Arden stepped in, inches closer. Your role is the safety of every soul on this plane. That code, 7C, is my son. He was slapped across the face, Captain. This wasn't random. He was marked. The words landed like thunder. The captain's face blanched. Back in the main cabin, chaos stirred again. Corvin Morel, still seated near the rear galley but visibly agitated, leaned over the aisle and whispered loudly to a cluster of nearby passengers. Listen, this has gotten out of hand. If we all just delete the videos now, I can fix this. We can land, file complaints properly. Don't ruin your chance to be part of the solution. His voice cracked with artificial confidence, but no one bought it. Rendell Kaur, the passenger who had first shown the video, stood up again with defiance in his posture. You laid a hand on a child. Then you tried to lie. Now you're bargaining? Every second you talk, this gets worse for you. Corvin's mouth snapped shut. He sank back in his seat. The turbulence grew heavier. Lights flickered again, momentarily darkening the cabin in a low pulse. The flight attendants fastened themselves in, but Arden, returning from a galley, moved with precise calm. Then he saw it. Another clipboard, smaller than the first, tucked sloppily behind the beverage cart near the forward lavatory. He moved quickly, retrieving it without a word. His eyes scanned the label, Observation Rotation A. His breath caught as he flipped it open. Initials matched with seat numbers. 11 9F, then JR7C. Arden froze. The realization struck with crushing clarity. This wasn't an accident. Jalen was not a victim of impulse. He was a target. His son had been flagged. He returned to Jalen and knelt beside him, holding the clipboard so only they could see. Jay, he said quietly, voice trembling in a way Jalen had never heard. This wasn't random. Jalen's face paled further. What do you mean? Arden hesitated, then whispered the words like a vow carved in stone. "They flagged my son." He smirked, confident the teen would stay silent, unaware that every eye in the cabin was about to witness the real authority rise. If you believe arrogance under a uniform always collapses when faced with courage, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. Corvin Morell's body jolted upright the moment Arden whispered something inaudible to his son. The panic on the attendant's face betrayed everything: guilt, fear, and the dreadful realization that control was slipping away. In a single, frantic motion, Corvin tried to rise from his seat, his hand gripping the edge of the aisle wall, as if it could somehow anchor him back into authority. But Arden was faster. Without raising his voice or changing the expression on his face, Arden stepped into Corvin's path. His arm moved with controlled precision, guiding the man's shoulder back down into the seat as if pressing a lever into place. It was not forceful. It didn't need to be. The silent, surgical nature of the gesture made it even more unsettling. The other passengers watched with wide eyes, breath held. No one moved. "You don't want to do anything else you'll regret," Arden said softly, his voice firm but quiet, like someone pointing out the edge of a cliff in fog. Corvin didn't respond at first, only clenched his jaw and looked past Arden at Jalen, whose small frame was now partially shielded by his father's presence. Then came the words, a hiss low enough to be missed by most, but not by Arden. "We were just following orders," Corvin muttered, eyes darting. It wasn't personal. That phrase cracked the floor beneath the moment. Arden's gaze locked in. "Whose orders?" he asked, no louder than before. Corvin didn't answer. His silence echoed louder than any lie. Behind them, the aircraft continued its descent, each subtle drop in altitude deepening the gravity of the moment. The hum of the engines had become a kind of tension soundtrack, underscoring the unraveling truth. Arden returned to Jalen and knelt down once more, blocking the view of the flight attendants. His hand rested on his son's arm gently, grounding him. "You did nothing wrong," he said clearly. This was never your fault." Jalen nodded slowly, the corners of his mouth trembling from the weight of everything. His eyes were glassy, but he was holding strong. I didn't understand what I did," Jalen whispered, his voice tight and raw. Arden's jaw flexed. "You didn't do anything," he replied. "But now we know more. And now we act." From the front, the captain's voice emerged again, suggesting, more nervously this time, that perhaps further discussion and statements should be saved for after landing. Arden didn't even look at him. "It's already being handled," he said calmly. The captain blinked in confusion. "Handled?" Arden glanced toward his watch. The silent alert protocol had been activated earlier, triple pressed under his cuff, the transmission sent to the Aerocline Integrity Bureau's emergency node. The moment the aircraft touched the tarmac, federal response officers would be waiting at Gate 32. He turned back to Jalen. "We're not waiting," he said. Behind them, Corvin's composure crumbled. His breathing sped up. He looked toward Varek, the other attendant, who avoided his eyes completely. The whispering among passengers grew louder now, like the low stir of wind before a storm. One man asked softly if he could check his boarding pass. Another wondered if he, too, had been scanned more than once. "Dad," Jalen's voice trembled. "There's something I forgot." Arden leaned closer. Before it happened, he scanned my pass again. I didn't get why. Just twice." He looked at it longer the second time. Arden's eyes narrowed. That detail, a second scan, the clipboard markings, the coded comments, the initials by each seat, locked together in his mind like tumblers clicking into place. This wasn't just about misconduct. It was a system, a structure pretending to be customer service, a surveillance layer disguised as routine protocol. Jalen had been flagged. Arden stood up, now fully centered in the aisle, and addressed the cabin. "I know this has been a disturbing flight for many of you," he began, his voice calm but resonant. "You've seen something you weren't meant to see, but I want to assure every person here, you are not in danger now. No one else will be touched, and every person responsible for what happened today will be held accountable. Fully, transparently." All eyes were on him, not because he had a badge, not because he threatened anyone, but because his voice carried the kind of calm people only believe when it's real. Varric sat with his head bowed, motionless. Corvin stared ahead, his hands trembling in his lap. The aircraft shuddered slightly as the clouds thinned, revealing the cityscape below, lights blinking faintly beneath the fading horizon. And Arden, still standing tall, placed his hand on the seat back nearest Jalen, anchoring the moment in quiet resolve. The descent continued, but now truth was descending too. The landing gear dropped with a metallic thud beneath the aircraft's belly, shaking the floor slightly as passengers stiffened in their seats. The sudden sound broke the fragile silence, pressing tension tighter around every shoulder, every breath. Jalen Rurik clutched his father's sleeve with white-knuckled fingers, the bruise on his cheek still fresh and glowing under the cabin lights. The boy's eyes flicked nervously toward the front, where Corvin Morell leaned toward fellow Attendant Varric Dunn, whispering with a frantic edge. "Get rid of it," Corvin hissed, his voice brittle. "The clipboard. Destroy it before touchdown." But before Varric could move, a blur of motion cut between them. Arden Rurik stepped forward with quiet command, intercepting the handoff in one smooth motion. His fingers wrapped around the clipboard with a controlled firmness, and without breaking stride, he placed it calmly into the side compartment of his bag. His eyes didn't glare, but the calm focus in them was sharper than any accusation. He didn't raise his voice, but the tension in the air crackled as if he had shouted. "You won't be destroying anything," Arden said, his tone level but final. Captain Reddenvale approached from the cockpit with deliberate steps, trying to compose the authority he felt slipping with each passing minute. He cleared his throat, voice neutral but taut. "Sir, I must inform you. Documenting internal flight materials could result in legal complications for you and others." Arden turned toward him slowly. "The only legal complications," he replied, "will be for those who assaulted my son and those who authorized the system to target passengers by seat." A quiet murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin. The atmosphere had changed. The passengers no longer sat in silence. They watched. They remembered. They bore witness. Redden's mouth opened again, but he didn't speak. The lines of authority were shifting too quickly beneath his feet. He looked toward Corvin and Varric, whose shoulders were now tight with panic. Varric attempted one final dodge. "Those logs are harmless. Training notes. That's all. Internal flight practice." Before Arden could respond, Rendell Kaur, the same passenger who had bravely filmed the assault, rose from his seat and lifted his tablet. "That's not true," he said, his voice firmer now, no longer shaking. "Watch this again." He replayed the moment, Corvin glancing at the clipboard, his finger tapping Jalen's seat number, and then walking directly toward the boy with that hostile expression seconds before the slap. The screen lit up the faces of nearby passengers as they leaned closer. The evidence was undeniable. From row 11, a man with a quiet demeanor stood. His voice carried with slow confidence. "I recognize those codes. I used to work for an airline development team. That's behavioral testing notation. We used similar markings years ago, but the program was shut down." Arden pivoted, eyes narrowing. "Are you certain?" The man nodded once. "We flagged passengers to monitor their reactions under controlled stress, but it was deemed unethical. Shut down, at least officially." A gasp caught in someone's throat. Eyes turned toward Corvin and Varric, who were now cornered not by force, but by truth. Jalen's voice broke through the heaviness of the moment. He stood slowly, gathering strength from his father's calm presence. He looked at the clipboard. Jalen said, his voice quiet but steady. "Right before he hit me, I saw him. He checked my seat number. Twice." The entire cabin turned toward the boy. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was a witness. The weight that had hovered above the rows suddenly shifted, landing squarely on the crew who had abused their position. Arden looked at Jalen with a pride he didn't need to voice. The boy had done something few could. He stood tall in the face of harm, and now his voice was part of the proof. The aircraft shuddered slightly as it dropped altitude further. The captain's voice came through the intercom, mechanical and thin. "We've been cleared for final approach." Please remain seated and secure all items. Outside the windows, the runway lights came into view, a glowing path cutting through darkness. Inside, however, the cabin had never been brighter with clarity. Corvin shrank into his seat, sweat beading on his forehead. Varric looked out the window, as if searching for some invisible exit. Arden exhaled, slow and steady. His objective was no longer just to respond to the violence. It was to expose the structure that allowed it, document it, and dismantle it piece by piece. As the wheels met the tarmac in a jolting, rubber-gripping impact, the plane's body shuddered with a final groan of descent. Passengers held their breath, not just from the landing, but from the knowledge that everything was about to change. Arden leaned toward Jalen, his hand steady on the boy's shoulder, and whispered just above the rumble of the slowing engine. "This ends the moment these doors open." The aircraft rolled to a stop at Gate 32, its tires groaning beneath the weight of truths not yet spoken. No one stood. Not a passenger, not a crew member. The hush inside the cabin felt heavier than the humming silence of the slowing engines. Jalen sat close to his father, his bruised cheek resting gently against the edge of Arden's coat. Arden kept a hand steady on his son's shoulder, eyes fixed ahead, waiting not for the standard deplaning announcement, but for justice to arrive. Across the aisle, Corvin Morrell sat rigid, the collar of his uniform damp with sweat, jaw clenched so tightly it trembled. Varric Dunn, once defiant, now shrank into the wall near the galley, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his name tag, as if willing it to disappear. The two exchanged a glance, brief, nervous, almost pleading. They both knew. The moment the doors opened, the illusion they'd clung to would shatter in front of everyone. Then came a hiss. The mechanical whine of the jet bridge locking into place sliced through the silence, and a moment later, the door cracked open. But it wasn't routine personnel who stepped through. 6 men in dark navy coats entered swiftly, their Aerocline Integrity Bureau badges gleaming under the overhead lights. Their movements were deliberate, their faces unreadable. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Whispers gave way to stunned stares as the lead officer, a tall man with silver at his temples and an authoritative stride, stopped before Arden, not Corvin, not the captain, and said, with crisp formality, "Investigator Rurik, we received your encrypted alert. We're here to secure the scene." Corvin's lips parted slightly, the breath in his lungs caught halfway out. It was then, only then, that the realization sunk in. The man he had slapped the child of wasn't just another passenger. He was the lead investigator whose name quietly haunted backroom conversations in federal compliance circles. Arden nodded once, his voice calm. "First priority is the minor. My son's been struck in the face. He needs to be checked by medical personnel immediately." The officers turned without hesitation. One of them called into his earpiece, summoning a terminal medic. Another moved toward Jalen, kneeling beside him gently. The boy flinched, but Arden offered a firm nod of reassurance. "It's all right, son. They're here for you." Corvin's breath quickened. He shifted slightly, glancing toward the rear of the plane. Varric took one small step back. But before either could act, 2 agents flanked them from either side, standing just close enough to cut off any path to retreat. "Remain seated," one of them said, voice like stone. The cabin, still packed with passengers, transformed from an audience of bystanders into something else, witnesses. And the stage had changed too. This wasn't a flight anymore. It was a tribunal in the sky. Arden opened his bag and removed the 2 clipboards, the flight notes, and the encrypted data stick from his watch. All evidence collected midair: passenger statements, crew behavior logs, and a list of flag seat numbers, including minors, he said as he handed them over. "Received," the lead officer replied. "We'll begin chain of custody procedures immediately." Just then, a voice rose from the middle rows. "I recorded everything," Rendlecore said as he stood, tablet held in both hands like a fragile artifact. "I'll give my full statement. He hit the boy. I saw it. So did others." A murmur passed through the cabin. The courage in Rendell's voice unlocked others. One by one, men raised their hands, volunteering to speak. Every testimony added weight to the truth Arden had built piece by piece. From the cockpit, Captain Reddenvale emerged, attempting to salvage control. "I believe this should be handled internally," he said, tone firm but cracking at the edges. The response from the bureau officer was immediate. "It already is. Does not buy you." That shut the captain down. Corvin twitched. His eyes darted toward the rear again, toward the back galley. Then he lunged, making a sudden dash for the emergency exit hatch near the tail. But he didn't make it 2 steps. 2 officers blocked his path with synchronized precision, spinning him and pressing him into the sidewall. One secured his wrists behind his back, while another retrieved a small device from Corvin's pocket. "Flight crew member Corvin Morell," the agent said evenly, "you are being detained under Federal Aviation Ethics Code 12.5 and criminal assault statutes pending full investigation." Corvin didn't speak. He couldn't. Jalen, watching from row 7, stared at the scene with wide, steady eyes. Not scared anymore, just absorbing the weight of what had just unfolded. The agents instructed the remaining passengers to stay seated while the area was fully documented. The clipboard evidence, the footage, the statements, all of it was logged. Arden checked on Jalen once more, gently adjusting the ice pack a passenger had earlier handed him. The moment lingered, thick and resonant. This wasn't just the arrest of a crew member or a Madare investigation. It was a shift. A plane once sealed in silence had become a courtroom of air and truth. And the verdict was already starting to take shape. Jalen leaned closer to his father and whispered, "Are they gone?" Arden gave a quiet nod. "They're not going anywhere." The boy nodded slowly. The hum of the engines faded completely now. Outside, a new world waited. Inside the cabin, truth had taken its rightful place. Everything that happened in the air was now moving toward daylight. The interview room door clicked shut behind them, the soft latch barely audible over the low murmur of voices beyond the frosted glass. Arden Rurik guided Jalen into the room, not with urgency, but with a composed firmness that made the young boy feel safe, even in the aftermath of a violation no child should endure. The walls were a sterile pale blue, the overhead lights humming faintly. A single metal table stood in the center, flanked by 2 plastic chairs on one side and an examination cot on the other. A medical technician entered quietly, a slender man in his early 40s with kind eyes and a laminated badge clipped to his pocket. Theron Mall, Medical Services Division. He offered Jalen a nod of reassurance before gesturing to the cot. Jalen hesitated, his body still stiff from adrenaline, but Arden gave a slight nod. The boy moved. Theron worked with practiced care, examining Jalen's reddened cheek and carefully testing for deeper damage. "Mild contusion, but no bone or nerve involvement," he murmured, his voice low and even. "The swelling will fade in a day or 2. No fracture." Arden thanked him without looking away from his son, his voice clipped, precise. Theron handed Jalen a small ice pack wrapped in cloth. "Keep it pressed, no longer than 15 minutes at a time," he said, then quietly excused himself. As the door clicked again, Arden's eyes narrowed. The space had grown quieter, but the silence now carried weight. His thoughts were already turning toward the deeper threat that had revealed itself on Flight 417. Not just the slap, but the program, the clipboard, the phrase, "the program's going to burn." Another knock, firmer this time. A tall, broad-shouldered man entered, wearing a black Aerocline Bureau vest with the badge of the Oversight Division stitched above his left pocket. "Jorik Vale," he said with a respectful nod. "We're grateful for your alert, Dr. Rurik. I've read your credentials. We've been tracking whispers of something similar." Arden stood, but didn't offer a handshake. "Define similar." Jorik stepped forward, lowering a thick dossier onto the table. "A behavioral analysis system," he said. "Experimental. We'd heard rumors, flight crews given instructions to provoke, observe, and document certain passenger reactions. Always unofficial. Always denied." He opened the folder to a page showing a list of symbols identical to those on the clipboard Arden had confiscated. "The clipboard from Corvin?" Arden asked, his voice low. "Matches these exactly," Jorik confirmed. "We've seen fragments of these in separate complaints." Never enough to prove anything until now. Arden's jaw tightened. "My son," he said, gesturing toward Jalen, who sat quietly, clutching the ice pack. He was targeted. His seat number flagged. And someone added his name recently. There was no anger in his tone, just precision. That made it more unsettling. Jorik nodded grimly. "We'll be collecting full passenger statements. The footage from Rendell Core, your witness, has already been uploaded and logged. We've also begun questioning the crew." As if on cue, the door opened again and a younger officer stepped in. "Sir, Varek Dunn is ready to give a statement." Jorik looked at Arden. "We can bring him in here." "Do it," Arden said. "And make sure he understands I'm not just a witness. I'm auditing his words for inconsistencies." Minutes later, Varek Dunn entered. He looked smaller now, stripped of his uniform and status. No name plate, no power. Just a man with slumped shoulders and eyes that darted from Arden to Jalen and back again. He sat across the table, arms resting but fingers twitching against the edge. "I didn't hit the boy," he began quickly. "You stood beside the one who did," Arden said, his voice level. "And you tried to bury the evidence." Varek hesitated. "We weren't trying to hurt anyone. We were following instructions." Arden's brow furrowed. "Whose instructions?" "I don't know his real name." "We never did." Varek swallowed. "We called him the coordinator. He sent briefings, seat numbers, behavioral prompts." Jorik leaned forward. "What prompts?" "Things like delay water service to these rows, interrupt tablet use, change temperature zones subtly, then observe, make notes." "And if they reacted?" Arden asked sharply. Varek didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the side of his jumpsuit and produced a sealed envelope. These were today's flag passengers. We weren't allowed to keep them past the flight. Arden opened the envelope, eyes scanning the list. There were seat numbers, names, ages. Several were marked as minors. Jalen's was there. So were 3 others, all seated in scattered middle rows. A long silence followed. Arden placed the envelope on the table slowly. "You experimented on children," he said, each syllable measured, his voice a razor. "With no consent, no safeguards, and you called it observation." "I didn't know," Varek's voice cracked. "We thought it was behavioral research. We were told it was legal." "No," Arden said, standing now. "It was a test without permission, on a system where power is already unbalanced. You weaponized authority." Jorik stepped between them, raising a hand. "Dr. Rurik, we'll extract the coordinator's contact and trace this chain. You have my word." Arden didn't sit. His hand rested lightly on Jalen's shoulder. Varek slumped forward, head in hands, as 2 officers entered to escort him out. One turned to Jorik. "Corvin still refuses to speak. Claims he's waiting for legal representation." Jorik nodded. "Let him wait." As the room cleared again, Arden stared at the list on the table. The names, the numbers, the silent footprints of a system hiding in plain sight. Jalen shifted in his seat. "Why me?" he asked, voice small. Arden looked at him. "Because injustice needs silence to grow. And you didn't stay silent." Jalen blinked slowly, then nodded. Outside, more passengers were being interviewed. The station buzzed with new reports. But inside this room, something had crystallized. A father's calm fury, a child's resilience, a program that had gone too far, finally pulled into the light. Arden stared at the list one more time, then folded it neatly, placed it into the evidence bag, and said in a voice that left no room for argument, "More was buried here, and he intended to dig it all out." The door clicked shut behind Arden as he stepped back into the inquiry chamber. The atmosphere inside was sterile, the lights overhead humming softly, but the tension was unmistakable, coiled and waiting. On a bench just outside the glass-paneled room, Jalen sat quietly under the careful eye of an officer, his cheeks still swollen, but his shoulders more relaxed. He sipped warm water slowly, the paper cup trembling slightly in his fingers. The chaos of the flight was behind them, but its aftershocks rippled through every moment now. Inside, the envelope from Varek sat at the center of the table like a live wire. The lead investigator, Officer Jorik Vale, a tall man with sharp eyes and a voice made for interrogation rooms, slid the contents onto the steel surface. His gaze passed across the small group of officers before returning to Arden. These were tucked in Varek Dunn's jacket. You may want to see this. Arden reached for the documents and spread them out. Seat numbers, flight codes, passenger initials, a column labeled Observed Reactions, and then one column, darker than the rest, titled PRET, Passenger Response Evaluation Tier. He didn't speak right away. He didn't have to. The truth screamed through the silence. Jalen's seat number, 7C, was among the names. His initials were circled. A low, controlled exhale escaped Arden's lips. He was marked, he said quietly. Someone chose my son before that plane even took off. Added 2 hours before departure. Officer Vale confirmed grimly. We traced the timestamp. His name wasn't there this morning. Arden's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. His mind worked faster than his expression revealed. This wasn't just misconduct. This was design. The door creaked open and another officer entered, guiding in a man with silver hair and a stiff walk. Marin Leff, shift supervisor for the Aerolith operations team. He sat, folding his hands in front of him. I was told this was regarding an on-board incident, he said. His voice carried the false calm of someone used to evading trouble. Arden slid the flagged list across the table. Marin barely glanced down. I'm not sure what I'm looking at. Look again, Arden said. His tone didn't rise, but it pressed with the weight of a gavel. When Marin's eyes landed on the initials and the word PRET, his composure faltered. A muscle in his jaw twitched. I looked, that program isn't active. It was decommissioned years ago. But someone's running it, Arden said. On your shift, under your supervision, or worse, under your direction. Marin shook his head slowly, stalling. I didn't approve anything. This must be some outdated log. We traced the timestamp, Vale interrupted. This list was printed from your terminal, 2 hours before flight 417 departed. A cold silence descended. Marin's eyes flicked toward the mirrored wall, then back to Arden. We were told to stress test certain passengers, Marin muttered finally. But it wasn't mandatory, just a behavioral initiative. Some observation protocol from a past study. I thought it was harmless. You encouraged crew to provoke strangers, Arden said, rising slightly. You used real people, real children, without their consent. I didn't know a child would be flagged. Marin barked, panic cracking his voice. Arden leaned in. You didn't ask. The door opened again. Officer Vale re-entered with a new report and approached Arden quietly. We just interviewed Rendell, the passenger with the video. He says he saw Corvin speaking to someone in the terminal before boarding. A man in a navy coat. He passed Corvin a sealed envelope. Arden's jaw tightened. External instructions. This isn't isolated. Someone's pulling the strings. The walls of the investigation room began to feel smaller, foreshadowing cast long shadows. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something larger. Arden's objective sharpened once again. Uncover the full network behind this program and shut it down at the source. Across the hall, Jalen shifted on the bench as 2 new officers entered. He glanced toward the door as Marin was escorted out in cuffs, followed moments later by Corvin, now fully restrained and silent, his eyes fixed on the floor. Arden emerged last, walking toward his son with steady steps, his coat brushing lightly behind him like a wave of resolve. Varek, still seated in the secondary room, looked down at his hands. He had chosen to confess, but the weight of what he participated in clung to him like ash. He would give names. He would give dates. Arden placed a hand gently on Jalen's shoulder. Jalen looked up, eyes steady despite all he had endured. You okay? Arden asked softly. Jalen gave a small nod. Yeah, just tired. Arden nodded in return, voice calm but carrying the echo of fire. Good, because we're not done yet. He looked past the walls of the inquiry room, past the corridors of the terminal, toward something larger waiting to be revealed. Every program has a source. Every injustice, a spine. And this one was beginning to crack. The next step was no longer just justice. It was reform. The gavel struck once, sharp and final, cutting through the hush that had fallen over the vaulted hearing chamber of the Aerocline Oversight Council. Arden Rurik did not flinch. He stood centered beneath the high arch of lights, the seal of the council gleaming behind him in bronze relief. The air felt heavy, not with silence, but with the sheer weight of truth pressing against every wall in the chamber. This wasn't just another hearing. This was reckoning. He adjusted the slim folder in his hand and met the eyes of the 12 council members seated in a semicircle before him. Each man wore a distinct expression, some guarded, some weary, a few visibly rattled. And yet none could look directly at the screen behind Arden, where a freeze frame still hovered. Corvin Morel's open pomander, Jalen's head turned in recoil. Arden's voice was steady as he began. 3 weeks ago, aboard Aerolith Flight 417, a 14-year-old boy was struck in the face by a crew member. That moment, documented, recorded, and corroborated, was the result not of isolated misconduct, but of a systematic, unauthorized behavioral surveillance initiative. He paused, letting the words settle. Behind him, seated near the gallery wall, Jalen sat upright beside a formal council observer. His cheek had healed, but the memory lived in his posture, still alert, still guarded. Arden had offered to let him stay home. Jalen refused. "I stand before you today," Arden continued, "not just as an investigator, nor as a federal consultant. I stand as a father. And I must ask this council, how many flights, how many passengers, how many children have already been flagged, prodded, or harmed in the name of unregulated analysis?" Murmurs stirred among the audience rows. Policy advisors, passenger rights advocates, former pilots, and a few press members granted restricted access. In the second row, Rendell Kaur, the teen who had captured the original footage, sat quietly, a small ID tag clipped to his jacket. His presence spoke louder than applause ever could. Councilman Herrenvale, the eldest of the group, shifted in his chair. "Mr. Rurik, this council has reviewed the submitted files. Are you confirming that the initiative passenger response evaluation tier was active and targeting minors?" Arden stepped forward once, his fingers tightening slightly around the folder. "I'm not confirming it," he said. "I'm proving it." With a sharp motion, he placed 3 documents into the overhead projector slot. The screen filled with columns of flag names and seat numbers. Jalen's was among them, along with others from separate flights, some highlighted in red, some labeled with cryptic behavioral tags. Gasps rose from the gallery. Arden didn't look away from the council. These documents were recovered from 2 separate clipboards aboard Flight 417. They were corroborated by a flight attendant's confession under investigation. Furthermore, surveillance at Velmer Terminal captured crew interactions with third-party actors believed to be involved in the initiation of the program. All of this was done without passenger consent, without regulatory approval, and with no formal review process. One of the council members, Jarek Saul, leaned forward. "And you believe this is spread beyond Aerolith?" Arden nodded once. "The structure, terminology, and logging system indicate this isn't isolated. The program's architecture suggests multi-airline penetration. It's a data-driven evaluation loop disguised as crew observation, with passengers treated as variables. That is not safety. That is experimentation." A stunned silence followed, broken only when Jalen stood up. The entire chamber turned. Jalen cleared his throat softly. "They scanned my ticket twice," he said. "Then they wrote something down before anything happened. I didn't do anything wrong. I just asked for water." Arden turned his gaze toward his son, a subtle warmth breaking through his otherwise steeled expression. Jalen sat down again slowly, but what he had said couldn't be unsaid. The room had heard the truth from the mouth of its youngest witness. Councilman Vale looked deeply shaken. "Mr. Rurik, years ago, this council received an internal alert about unauthorized behavioral testing. We dismissed it. It seemed like a theoretical concern. We never imagined," he trailed off, guilt forming in the corners of his voice. Arden didn't judge him. "Most systems fail not through malice," he said, "but neglect. But today that ends." The final screen behind him changed again, now displaying the proposed policy document. Bold at the top were the words, "The Rurik Passenger Safeguard Protocol." The protocol called for complete transparency of all cabin practice documentation, third-party data use bans, strict biometric and behavioral audit restrictions, and real-time passenger feedback options during flight. Most notably, it criminalized any experimental observation of flagged individuals without formal consent or oversight, especially minors. Councilman Saul read the title aloud. "The Rurik Protocol," he said slowly. "Named after your son?" "I didn't choose the name," Arden replied. "The Bureau did. I would have preferred something more collective. But if it helps one other child walk onto a plane without being seen as a test, it's worth it." The gavel struck again. Unanimous approval. Corvin Morell, Marin Leff, and others named in the investigation would face federal hearings and civil suits. Their aviation certifications were already stripped. Varric Dunn had agreed to testify further in exchange for leniency. The initiative known as Passenger Response Evaluation Tier was officially declared illegal, and an emergency ethics audit of all affiliated airlines was ordered by the close of week. As passengers from Flight 417 rose to leave the chamber, Arden stepped toward Jalen, who had not stopped watching him since the decision. Outside, a small press line was forming, but the father ignored it. He crouched slightly beside his son. "You didn't just protect me," Jalen said quietly, voice filled with wonder and the weight of understanding. "You protected everyone." Arden smiled, placing a steady hand on his son's back, knowing their journey had reshaped the sky itself. He struck the teen and froze as the father stood, calm and commanding, every passenger watching dignity reclaim its place. If you believe true power speaks without shouting, subscribe now, because justice always lands where it's meant to. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights racism, abuse of authority, and the moment accountability confronts prejudice. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, justice, and treating every passenger with dignity and respect.